Check this out, guys. This is the 18 to 270 millimeter f3.5 to 6.3 Tamron super zoom lens. A lens that can give you 15 times the amount of zoom range. Now you might be thinking to yourself, wow, I can probably see the moon up close with this lens. I can probably zoom in to anything that I want to and never have to change my lens. You might be thinking that to yourself, and even though you're partially correct, a lot of people don't think about the drawbacks to having such a large zoom range. You might be thinking to yourself, well, what drawbacks? I wouldn't have any drawbacks with such a long zoom lens or such a wide zoom range because I can pretty much get any picture I want to. I might not even have to move. And even though you're partially correct, a lot of people don't understand the light input that comes with this lens. Notice that it's the f3.5 to 6.3 aperture lens, which means it's a variable aperture lens. You might be saying to yourself, aperture, what is that? Light input, how much light I get, what is that? Well, first thing you need to understand is aperture is a mechanism inside the lens, and this mechanism is like an opening and closing door depending on how much light you're letting in or aperture value you tune your camera to. The smaller the number, the brighter the lens gets, and the larger the number, the darker the lens gets. And hold tight because it's about to get a bit technical, but hang with me. A lot of people are going to be able to understand this, and it's very important to photography. Now, the first thing you really need to understand is that the camera itself is a light receiving device. That's pretty much its most basic function. The more light you have, the better the image quality. The less light you have, the less image quality you have. Now, when it comes to color reproduction and processing, that's a secondary thing that most people will just overwrite with a raw picture setting. But when you're talking about the light input, it's a direct variation or a direct correlation to how much image quality you're going to be able to get. So the darker things get, typically the worse the things get as far as color reproduction, sharpness, and all these other things. So going back to the technical portion, please stay along, guys. It's going to be very, very important if you don't understand this. f3.5 is the brightest aperture that this lens can get. f6.3 is the darkest aperture this lens can get. But what does that really mean? Like, what is that telling me? Okay, so going from, let's say, 3.5 to f5, that's one stop of light. That means you cut your light amount in half, going from 3.5 to f5. You might be like, what? A whole like you cut my light in half? Yes. You might not think that because the numbers don't seem that large. But that means you essentially cut the light input by half, which means you pretty much cut the light input or the actual image quality by half too, depending on what kind of sensor you have. A lot of sensors, especially when you're buying lenses this cheap, tend to be on cheaper bodies, like your Eos-r, your Canon Eos-r, these cheaper bodies, or your Canon R100. These are cheaper bodies, and so you'll have like a f3.5 going all the way to f6.3. That's a loss of 2 stops of light. 2 stops of light pretty much equals 4 times darker. Or that means you just started with, a quarter of the light that you started with. Or you end up with a quarter of the light that you started with. And that means you have 75% less light than you started with. Things are starting to come into context now. But if we go to the other side of the spectrum, we have the focal length, which at first you were like, oh, 18 to 275, a 15x zoom range. I can get to the moon. Yeah, that's okay. But, let's go to the focal length. The smaller the number, that's the wider you are. And the larger the number, the more telephoto you are. It's kind of self-explanatory. You can actually understand what it's telling you. It's really simple. But let's get deeper into this lens. Now, not every lens is the same if it's a variable aperture lens, but most of them are still going to what we call stop down or make the aperture smaller. Now, let's look at this aperture at 3.5. You have about 18 millimeters, which is your widest. You still have 3.5, which is great. But if you increase that by 7 millimeters, it'll go to f4. This f4 is at 25 millimeter range. So you're still pretty wide. You can get f4. That's 1/3 of a stop less. And so that's a 10 millimeter difference going to f4.5. You get 4.5, you're starting to get pretty dark here. And then you get a 35 millimeters, but you increase that by 10 millimeters to 45 millimeters, and it gives you f5. Then you increase that by 14 millimeters. That gives you 5.6 at 70 millimeters. And then you increase that by another 100 millimeters. Then you get 6.3, and you still get 100 millimeters after that, pretty much to 270 millimeters. But it looks like the wider you are, the less light input you have. And the more you zoom in, the light input doesn't change relative to what aperture you had before. But you get 252 millimeters of zoom, like I said before, 15 times the amount of range, for an increase going from 18 to 270 millimeters of 1,400%. So a lot of people would think, just in deductive reasoning, you don't think about it as 1,400%. You don't think about it as a loss of 75% of light for an increase of a 15 times zoom range. Now, notice I said 15 times zoom range because it's all relative to what lens you have or what lenses you have in your arsenal. If this is the only one, then it will be a 14% increase in range as far as, your zoom range. That 15 times zoom range is really, really important for a lot of photographers that are starting. A lot of photographers that are starting are not really thinking about how much, zoom range or spending the most amount of money. They just want to get a basic setup, and this will work perfectly fine for them. It's an ingenious design to have a variable aperture lens because manufacturers don't have to work as hard to make the lens. Cheaper product, cheaper build quality. You get vignetting, which is darkness around the corners a lot more, and you get barrel distortion, which is lines that are not straight. But unfortunately, the newer photographers and videographers don't really notice those optical issues so much as they notice the lack of light. I notice that a lot of my students know that the more they zoom in, the more cruddier the image looks and the more the noise affects their image. The less image quality they have, the less color quality they have. They feel that. They can see that in the image. You don't have to tell them twice. They're like, this looks like crap. Because I train them on manual mode, and we'll get into that in just another video. But when I train them on manual mode, they know immediately that, hey, there's something wrong with this camera lens setup. They don't know exactly that it's this. And I keep, telling them it's this, but it's hard for them to remember all of these things. But I'm laying them out here in this video for you so you'll understand that variable aperture lenses kill your image quality. And even though you get a 1,400% increase in range, you get the 15 times zoom range, you get 252 millimeters of zoom, a lot of people are going to see the lack of image quality. And most of the time when people upgrade to DSLRs, mirrorless cameras, going from crop frame sensors to full frame sensors, the first thing that they want to see is an increase in image quality. And that's why most pros have multiple lenses, multiple prime lenses. Prime lenses are lenses that are simple in construction but let more light in for the amount of money. And they get bigger lenses that weigh more, because even though the manufacturer have to work harder to make these lenses and they cost more, the payout in image quality is worth everything. I'm Devin with Century FX Studios TV, guys, back with another video. Stay tuned for the next video. We're going to talk about why manual mode helps you out with things like this. Stay tuned for the next episode.